Garry would say, well, he's on a 12-year scholarship to the University of Outer Mongolia.
The mystery of Chuck Cunningham's disappearance. One of television's strangest mysteries began in the most ordinary way. Chuck Cunningham was there one day, standing tall next to his younger brother Richie, holding a basketball and making casual jokes at the family dinner table. Then, without any warning or explanation, he was simply gone. No farewell episode, no mention of where he went, not even a single line of dialogue explaining his absence. It was as if Richie's older brother had never existed at all. For nearly 50 years, fans have wondered how a main character's family member could vanish from one of television's biggest shows without leaving a trace. If you watched the first 2 seasons of Happy Days in the mid-1970s, you knew Chuck as the oldest Cunningham child. He was the laid-back college student who played basketball, dropped by the house to grab food from the fridge, and gave quick waves before heading upstairs to study. While he wasn't the star of the show, he was a steady presence that helped round out the family dynamic. Then he disappeared completely. He didn't join the military, transfer to another college, or move away for work. He simply stopped existing in the Happy Days world. In later seasons, the Cunningham parents acted as if Richie only had one sibling, his younger sister Joni. There was no period of adjustment, no grief, and no acknowledgement that Chuck had ever been part of the family. Even in the show's final episode, when Father Howard Cunningham talked about his children, he mentioned having only 2 kids, completely erasing any memory of his eldest son. For years, viewers assumed they must have missed an episode that explained Chuck's departure, but there was no missing episode and no hidden script that revealed his fate. Chuck Cunningham had vanished so completely that his disappearance created its own term in popular culture. Chuck Cunningham syndrome became the phrase used to describe any television character who disappears without explanation, as if they never existed in the first place. Even the show's cast found the situation bizarre. In August 2025, Henry Winkler, who played the famous Fonzie character, posted on social media about Chuck's mysterious exit. He went upstairs and never came down, a mystery. This post was a playful nod to fans, confirming that yes, even the people making the show found the disappearance as strange as the audience did. But behind the jokes and decades of fan theories lies a complex story involving creative decisions, behind-the-scenes frustrations, changing priorities, and what might have been television's strangest experiment. Chuck Cunningham's vanishing act didn't just change the cast of Happy Days. It reshaped the entire show in ways no one could have predicted. The actor who wanted out. When Happy Days first aired in 1974, Chuck Cunningham was played by Gavan O'Herlihy, an Irish-born actor who had the perfect look for a relaxed college basketball player. At first, the role seemed like a great opportunity. He was part of a new hit sitcom set in an idealized 1950s America, created by Garry Marshall and supported by a strong cast of actors. However, O'Herlihy quickly realized that Chuck would never become a major character. In interviews years later, he explained that he found the role incredibly boring and poorly written. Chuck rarely had more than a few lines per episode, and those lines usually amounted to a single joke or a brief mention of basketball. O'Herlihy once described his work on the show as simply grunt, bounce a basketball, and leave. For a young actor with big ambitions, this was far from satisfying. Behind the scenes, O'Herlihy wanted to pursue more serious acting work, especially in movies. He had already appeared in several films before rejoining Happy Days, and was confident he could land more interesting and challenging roles. He could see that Chuck was never going to develop into a complex or memorable character. If anything, the show's focus was shifting away from the Cunningham family entirely and toward another character, a leather jacket-wearing mechanic who was quickly becoming a cultural sensation. So halfway through the second season, O'Herlihy made the bold decision to quit. This wasn't a case of being fired or pushed out of the show. By all accounts, he simply didn't want to continue playing a character he felt had no future. For an actor in his 20s, walking away from a popular television series was a risky move. But O'Herlihy didn't hesitate. He even turned down offers to return later when the show became more successful, permanently closing the door on Chuck Cunningham. For the production team, O'Herlihy's departure created an immediate problem. Chuck might have been a minor character, but he was still part of the show's family structure. You couldn't just remove the eldest Cunningham child without some sort of replacement, or could you? At the time, television shows were more casual about continuity, and audiences were less likely to demand perfect explanations for every character change. Still, the producers weren't ready to completely erase Chuck from the show, at least not yet. They decided to try one last approach to keep him around, but their solution would only make his eventual disappearance even more famous. The replacement that didn't work. After Gavan O'Herlihy left the show, the producers weren't ready to completely abandon Chuck Cunningham. Instead, they quietly hired another actor, Randolph Roberts, to take over the role for the rest of Season 2. The change was made without any explanation on screen, which was common practice at the time. Viewers simply tuned in one week and found a new face sitting at the Cunningham dinner table, with no fanfare or introduction. Roberts' version of Chuck kept the same basic characteristics as the original. As still a basketball-playing college student who appeared in short, casual scenes before heading upstairs or leaving the house. But if O'Herlihy had felt the role was underdeveloped, Roberts quickly found himself in the exact same situation. His version of Chuck appeared in only 2 episodes, delivering brief, functional dialogue that did nothing to develop his personality or make him more interesting. There were no major storylines involving Chuck, no defining character moments, and no attempts to give him more depth. His appearances felt almost like an afterthought, as if the writers were keeping him around out of obligation rather than creative vision. And then, just as suddenly as Roberts had arrived to replace O'Herlihy, his Chuck disappeared as well. After his final appearance, the eldest Cunningham sibling simply ceased to exist in the Happy Days universe. No character ever mentioned him again. No scene even hinted at where he might have gone, even during moments when a family gathering would have made perfect sense for him to attend, such as graduations, important milestones, or emotional episodes. Chuck was nowhere to be found. It was as though the show's writers had collectively decided he had never been part of the family at all. This complete erasure wasn't just unusual for television at the time, it was shocking. While 1970s television often replaced actors, wrote characters out of shows, or shifted focus without heavy explanation, it was extremely rare for a family member to disappear entirely with absolutely no acknowledgement. The lack of any resolution left a strange gap in the show's continuity that was impossible to ignore. Richie and Joni continued their lives as if they had always been the only Cunningham children, while viewers who remembered Chuck were left completely confused. This bizarre handling of Chuck's exit would later earn a special place in television history, becoming shorthand for any character who vanishes without explanation. But at the time, the decision was less about creating a legendary mystery and more about responding to changing priorities within the show itself. The birth of Chuck Cunningham syndrome. By the early 1980s, television critics and longtime viewers had given Chuck Cunningham's strange disappearance an official name that would outlive both the character and the show itself: Chuck Cunningham syndrome. This term became the standard way to describe any situation where a character simply disappears from a television series without explanation, never to be seen or mentioned again, as if they had been completely erased from the show's history. The phrase was created because Chuck's removal wasn't just casual or accidental. It was so complete and so deliberate that it effectively rewrote the Happy Days universe in real time. While other television shows had dropped characters before, Chuck's disappearance was different because of how important his role should have been. He wasn't a background extra or a neighbor who might quietly move away. He wasn't a colleague who could simply stop showing up at work. He was the eldest child in the Cunningham family, the very family that was supposed to be at the center of the entire show. This fact alone made the silence surrounding his exit feel strange and even disturbing to anyone who noticed. This wasn't just a simple casting change or a minor character adjustment. It was a complete narrative disappearing act, and the writers seemed to double down on it in a way that felt intentional. Fans who continued watching after Chuck's exit began to realize just how thoroughly the show avoided even the smallest reference to him. It wasn't that Chuck was away at school or traveling. The show acted as if Chuck had never been born. In later seasons, when Howard and Marion Cunningham discussed their children, they would only mention Richie and Joni B. name. Even in warm, sentimental episodes that looked back on the family's history, perfect opportunities for a nostalgic mention of an absent sibling, Chuck was nowhere to be found. The final season provided perhaps the most definitive erasure of Chuck's existence. In the series finale, Howard refers to having 2 children, not 3. In that moment, any lingering hope that Chuck might someday be mentioned or return was quietly and permanently buried. The phenomenon fascinated writers and critics who covered popular culture. Once the term Chuck Cunningham syndrome took hold, it began appearing everywhere in television criticism. Entertainment journalists and fans started using it to describe similar disappearances in other shows. Judy Winslow from Family Matters vanished mid-series without a goodbye. Minkus from Boy Meets World disappeared without a trace after the first season. Even shows like The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air had characters who quietly exited, and critics pointed back to Happy Days as the definitive example of this strange television trend. As years passed, the syndrome became part of the broader television vocabulary. It wasn't just about missing characters anymore. It revealed something important about sitcom audiences of that era. They were surprisingly willing to accept major continuity problems if the rest of the show kept them entertained. This was very different from the modern era, where online fan communities examine every plot detail and demand explanations for even the smallest inconsistencies. The rise of Fonzie. When Happy Days first premiered, the show was built around the Cunningham family and their wholesome middle American lifestyle. Richie was the central character, Joni was the kid sister, Chuck was the older brother, and Howard and Marion were the warm but slightly old-fashioned parents. However, as the series developed, another chiquise, a actor began to steal the spotlight in a way nobody had expected. Arthur Fonzarelli, better known as Fonzie, was originally intended to be a cool secondary character who would pop in occasionally for comic relief, or to serve as a contrast to Richie's clean-cut nature. Henry Winkler played him with such natural charm and magnetic presence that audiences couldn't get enough of him. By the end of the first season, fan mail was pouring in specifically for Fonzie. Viewers weren't just tuning in for Richie's adventures anymore. They were watching to see what Fonzie would do next. Fonzie had everything that sitcom producers dream of: swagger, memorable catchphrases, and the kind of magnetic screen presence that made him impossible to ignore. This sudden surge in popularity had major effects on the entire show. Fonzie began appearing in more and more episodes, often serving as Richie's guide, protector, or partner in various adventures and mishaps. Slowly but surely, Fonzie started occupying the narrative space that an older brother like Chuck might have naturally filled. When Richie needed advice about girls, Fonzie was there to give it. When Richie needed backup in a difficult situation, Fonzie provided it. In many ways, he became Richie's big brother figure without ever being related to the family. Garry Marshall, the show's creator, quickly noticed the natural chemistry between Henry Winkler and Ron Howard, who played Richie. Their conversations felt authentic and lively, and most importantly, audiences absolutely loved watching them together. Rather than fight against the natural pull toward Fonzie's character, the writers decided to embrace it completely. Chuck, a character who had never been given much development or a clearly defined purpose, became less and less necessary to the show's success. Why keep him around when Fonzie could do everything Chuck was supposed to do, but do it much better and with far more entertainment value? As Fonzie's popularity exploded beyond anyone's expectations, the shift in the show's focus became impossible to miss. He moved from being a background figure in a leather jacket to sharing top billing with Richie. In later seasons, he was arguably the show's true star. Merchandise featured his image, major storylines revolved around his character, and his cultural influence was so powerful that Happy Days itself seemed to completely reshape around him. By the time Chuck disappeared entirely from the show, audiences were so wrapped up in the dynamic between Richie and Fonzie that they barely looked back or questioned what had happened. What had started as a subtle casting change became a complete realignment of the show's center of gravity. Fonzie hadn't just replaced Chuck in the story. He had erased him from the audience's memory and made his absence feel natural rather than strange. The deliberate experiment. Years after Happy Days established itself as one of television's most beloved sitcoms, creator Garry Marshall finally spoke more openly about Chuck Cunningham's strange disappearance. According to Marshall, the decision wasn't just a matter of dropping an underused character who wasn't working out. It was also a deliberate test of how much attention audiences actually paid to continuity, and whether they would even notice such a dramatic change. Marshall's thinking reflected the era's much more relaxed approach to television storytelling. In 1970s sitcoms, audiences were accustomed to sudden, unexplained changes. Sets could be completely redecorated overnight between episodes. Minor characters might vanish without a word of explanation, and even major actors could be replaced mid-season with no on-screen acknowledgement. If viewers liked the new situation better than the old one, the show would simply move forward without looking back. Chuck's disappearance was just to the most extreme example of this approach. Sitcoms like Scrubs and Arrested Development included subtle jokes about characters disappearing, Chuck Cunningham style. Even Happy Days cast members embraced the running gag in interviews and reunion specials, with Henry Winkler's 2025 social media post serving as a perfect example. He went upstairs and never came down. A mystery. This post was a playful acknowledgement of decades of fan jokes and theories. What made the Chuck Cunningham phenomenon so enduring wasn't just the oddity of the disappearance itself, but what it revealed about television storytelling and audience behavior. Chuck's vanishing act proved that if a show is strong enough in other areas, whether through character chemistry, humor, or cultural relevance, audiences will forgive, and sometimes even completely forget major continuity problems. It demonstrated that television success is as much about audience perception and emotional connection as it is about strict narrative logic and consistency. The phenomenon also highlighted the difference between television eras. In the 1970s, audiences were more willing to accept unexplained changes and focus on their current entertainment rather than demanding detailed explanations for every plot development. This was very different from modern television viewing, where online communities analyze every detail and creators are expected to maintain tight continuity across all episodes and seasons. Today, nearly 50 years after Chuck walked upstairs for the last time and never came back down, his absence is still regularly discussed in nostalgic articles, television retrospectives, and online videos analyzing classic sitcoms. In a strange and ironic twist, Chuck Cunningham has become far more famous for being erased from Happy Days than he ever was for actually appearing on the show. His brief time on screen may have been completely forgettable, but his vanishing act became legendary. Chuck Cunningham syndrome remains a standard term in television criticism and popular culture discussion. It serves as a reminder of a different era of television production and audience expectations, when characters could simply disappear without explanation, and viewers would accept the change as long as the show remained entertaining. The mystery of Chuck Cunningham's disappearance continues to fascinate new generations of television fans, proving that sometimes the most memorable television moments are the ones that never actually happened on screen. In the end, Chuck achieved a kind of immortality through his absence, becoming a permanent part of television history precisely because he was so thoroughly erased from it.